The Complexity of Integration, drawn simply by Jordan Trapp. That's me. So, what we're going to be talking about is, just as the title said, integration and its complexities. So, basically, how most people perceive integration at the time was that there are these black people, and then there are also these white people. And these white people, with all of their money and their infrastructure and everything, see, they're happy over here, but the black people separated from the white people are sad. And for the most part, that's pretty much the truth. But here comes the complexities, where people also believe that simply breaking down the barrier of integration is what black people wanted to have happen, and that would make them happy. We'll find, as I explain further, that the topic of integration is just as divisive for black people as it is white people, being that they didn't completely agree, or the black community as a whole didn't completely agree on what integration should be, or should it even take place in the first place. So basically, the idea that I want to get into here is the difference between something we're going to be calling integrationists and desegregationists. First, I'll introduce a group of people called the integrationists. These are the black people that had the same ideals that you were taught in school, where they wanted to assimilate with the white community and that way become equal and have the splendors that white people have. So we see, clearly I'm going to be drawing it with these black people with white people. Now, there's nothing particularly groundbreaking about the integrationists, except for the fact that I have even made a distinction between integrationists and a different section of thought. This different section of thought is something that I'll be introducing right now. The second school of thought is called the desegregationists. And the desegregationists are exactly what they sound like. They wanted to break down segregation. And now the integrationists wanted this too. However, the integrationists, as per their name, wanted to integrate very specifically. Desegregationists wanted the end of segregation, but did not necessarily want to assimilate themselves into white culture. See, here where I have this black line representing segregation, you can merely break this down, right? And so here, now as long as these black people, these desegregationists, are now obtaining the rights and the privileges that the white people have, they would be happy with this, whereas the integrationists, as I've shown before in the previous slide, would prefer to be around the white people in order to gain that equality. An easy mistake to make is trying to compare the desegregationist ideology with the separate but equal ideology of segregation. But the difference between these two things is that these desegregationists, they didn't necessarily want to be separate from the white community. They just wanted to have the option of doing so. They wanted to be able to go around white people and not be harassed and not be treated unfairly, but also they wanted to be unified with other people of their kind, of their culture. So they can have all of these little stickmen that I'm drawing with them and be happy. And not necessarily have to converse or communicate with that many white people if they didn't want to. So you might be asking why the desegregationists had their ideology as opposed to how the integrationists wanted to assimilate with the white community. Well, there are three main points here that I want to get across. First is the practicality. Second is cultural unity. And lastly, but for sure, definitely not least, in fact, probably the most significant that I want to get across here in this video is fear. One of the best examples of the desegregationists not wanting to integrate because of practicality is busing. So, usually, black children would be in not so good areas around the cities. So, here, I'll draw a little city. and their predominantly black schools would be somewhere in this city, usually on in the center of it, inner city. And then when busing came into play, they would take these black children from where they were already going to school and take them to a predominantly white school. These predominantly white schools could have been on the other side of the city, could have been in the suburbs. Typically, they're far. Desegregationists, instead of trying to bust the children, what they wanted to do was help the predominantly black schools become better so that the black people could get a good education within a comfortable range from their house, just as the white students did. The desegregationist idea of cultural unity is actually one that's pretty easy to grasp. You see, it's black people wanting to be around other black people. And there's plenty of reason that a black person might not necessarily want to converse or be around white people, especially in this time. They just didn't feel like they were welcome or in place around these white people, especially at the time with racism so rampant. 1954, the time of when integration first got implemented, these desegregationists were actually a large part of the black community, and they wanted to unify and stay together as opposed to trying to win rights from white people by being with them and being like them. Fear. It's important to remember that black people were harassed and assaulted and violently berated and hurt by segregation and slavery and things like that in America. So when it's not taught that these desegregationists exist and black people that did not want necessarily to integrate exist, it kind of diminishes the perceived significance of such an event. See, when people are afraid and they don't want to converse with people that aren't like them, especially people of the race that oppress them. Black people, they see or they saw white people as these figures of power and fear mongers that could easily have them hurt or even killed. One white person felt so much bigger than all of these black people and struck fear in all these black people's hearts. I say all this to clarify the idea that black people were often scared to integrate. I say this to emphasize that black people were often scared to integrate. See, earlier I made the very simple drawing that black people were sad without integration. They were sad with segregation. And this was due to their lack of equality. Integrationists have the ideology that breaking down this segregational barrier will help and make it easier for black people to reach this equality. And while that might actually be the case, it's important to make the distinction that not all black people felt this way because they were scared. And because if you skip that idea, then you lessen the significance of these past events. So here I've broken down the segregation barrier, and these black people, if they're desegregationists, they want to stay here. They want to stay away with the space between them, even though that the barrier itself is gone. You might put over a white person over here next to him, and he would feel fear. So to conclude, I don't want anyone to think that I don't support integration. I'm extremely happy that I get to go to a school as diverse as this, or any school really that has so many different races, blacks and whites together. However, I just want to continue to emphasize the significance that we don't forget past events because they were horrific and they were important. I want people to carry that knowledge with them and take that knowledge and utilize it, put it towards their actions and their thinking so that the mistakes of the past never get relived and we don't stagnate as a society.